Well, hello. I hope you're having a wonderful day and glad that you have joined in for this Bible study on the book Holiness, which is by J.C. Ryle. We're going to spend the next 10 weeks looking at this book, a chapter each week. And so I hope that you'll take time to read through the chapter before you watch the video. Also, that you'll take time to complete your reading guide. I think that will be a help for you in understanding the chapter, but also taking the things that you learn in the chapter and applying them to your life. So, this first chapter is certainly a heavy one. I think it's very appropriate that it is the place that he starts, but it is certainly not an easy chapter to read because it causes us to reflect on ourselves, to reflect on our heart and our mind, and in particular to reflect on the topic of sin. What I want to do in each one of these studies is just to share with you some thoughts that I had from the book as I was reading. I'm going to read some short passages from the book, and these videos will be just kind of a short time of thinking through the chapter with you. And so, as he starts on this chapter, about sin, the first thing that we see is that he takes time to define very clearly what sin is. And this is of the utmost importance to us as we are thinking about our contemporary context and the time in which we find ourselves. Uh, no doubt, J.C. Ryle is dealing with some of the same issues in his day as we are dealing with in our own day. We see some similarities through the struggles that they're having and some of the things that are happening culturally in his context that we also see happening in our own. And so, as he defines sin, he wants to make it very clear about what sin is because many of the errors that we have seen throughout church history when it comes to the church, when it comes to understanding proper doctrine and theology, come from a loosening of the understanding about sin. And so, what is sin? Well, he refers to sin on page 8 as that vast moral disease which affects the whole human race. And I think we can definitely agree that that is the case. And so, what is it? What is this moral disease? Well, he writes that sin consists in doing, saying, thinking, or imagining anything that is not in perfect conformity with the mind and law of God. That is what sin is. And so, when we think about the totality of that, it's doing, which we can see that, right? We see when someone does something, they're committing a sin. We maybe can often understand that and witness it and see what it is. We can see that in our own life. But then it's saying, again, we see that. I think that one's maybe a little easier to see than some of the others. There are things that we can say or we others say, and it's clearly that is wrong. But then thinking or imagining anything that is not in perfect conformity with the mind and law of God. The things that we think, the things that we imagine, can certainly be sin. And so we want to understand this total definition, and not try to narrow the definition of sin so much that we make it where it's easy for us to escape thinking that we have sinned or fallen into sin. J.C. Ryle makes it very clear that sin is broad in its effect. And in fact, as we go through the chapter, we see that that is certainly the case in the broadness of sin. Now, what does sin affect in our life? Is, is sin just something that happens, again, when we speak or in something we do? Or is it just something that happens on occasion? Or something that we may think we have pretty good control of. He writes this: sin is a disease which pervades and runs through every part of our moral constitution and every faculty of our minds. The understanding, the affections, the reasoning powers, the will, are all more or less infected. What does sin do to a person? It infects a person completely, not just a little bit, not just in some areas. It's not that we are mostly good, but we have some struggles, some occasional shortcomings or character flaws that need to be dealt with. Now, the Bible pictures sin as an infectious disease that infects every part of us. And if we try to minimize sin and try to think that it's not really that big a deal or it's not really that bad, we need to understand that we are minimizing something that has truly infected the whole of who we are. So everything that we do, our decision making, our thought processes, um, our actions, they're all infected by sin. And it's one of the reasons we have to constantly examine ourselves to make sure that even our motives and intentions, even on doing things that seem to be good, have they been affected by the sin nature that so wholeheartedly, readily, ultimately consumes us? Because if we don't do that, uh, then we are prone to begin to allow sin to direct us even when we don't realize it, because we've not inspected our heart. We've not checked our heart, if you will, to make sure that what we are doing is because it's what God has told us to do, it's what Christ has called us to, or is it our sin beginning to infect us, our sin beginning to lead us in ways? Now, if sin infects all of us, our whole being, everything that we are, our will, our thinking, um, does it do that to everyone? And J.C. Ryle makes it very clear that not only is this a disease that infects us totally, but it's one that affects all mankind. He writes on page 13, um, every part of the world bears testimony to the fact that sin is the universal disease of all mankind. He says you can go anywhere in the world, any people group, any culture, any nation, and you'll find there that sin has infected everyone and everything. There's there's no place, there's no people that sin has not infected. We understand this very clearly if we go back in the Bible and we look at Genesis 1 and 2, and we see the creation of all humanity, and God makes everything, and He says about everything that He made that it is good. But then in Genesis chapter 3, our first parents, Adam and Eve, disobey God. And when they disobey God, they plunge all of creation into sin. And from that moment on, every person is born sinful. It is our nature. It's what we do. It's what becomes. It's what is natural to us because it is so infectious toward us. And so again, if we try to say, well, uh, people are good. Primarily, people at their core are good. We misunderstand the deadly reality of sin. If we begin to minimize that and we say, well, basically at the core, people are good. There's a few bad people here or there, but primarily, human beings are good people. Well, that's a problem because the Bible does not picture us as primarily good at our core. The Bible shows us a picture that from our first parents until now, every person born is born with that sin nature, born to disobey God. Only Christ was born without that propensity to disobey God, and He obeyed Him in every way. But we were born sinful, and our nature is to reject God and His Word and His commandments. And so we get into this pattern from the very beginning of our life of disobedience toward God, and it infects everything that we do, even if we try to do good and we try to do good so without Christ. We find that what we're doing is ultimately sinful before God. And God hates sin. And our sin is terrible. Our sin separates us from God. And if we want to understand the gravity of our sin, then we need only to look to Christ and his death on the cross. Ryle writes this, it's on page 16, terribly black must that guilt be, for which nothing but the blood of the Son of God could make satisfaction. That's how wicked and sinful we are. Our sin had so separated us from God that the only hope we had, the only hope of pushing back the wrath that was due us because of our sinfulness, was for Christ to go to the cross and die in our place. So when we think about how high that cost was, it helps us to understand how terribly awful our sin is. Our sin is such that we have no hope in our sin. We have no way to have fellowship with God and a relationship with God because our sin is so terrible. It has separated us from him. The fact that it took sending Jesus to die in our place should help us to understand the gravity of our sin. If our sin wasn't really that bad, then surely there would have been something else that God could have done. There would have been something else that would have paid the penalty for our sin. But our sin is so terrible before God that the only thing that could reconcile us to God was the death of his son on the cross and the shedding of his blood. Now, our sin deceives us from understanding how bad it is. Our sin is always at work minimizing for us in our heart how truly wretched we are before God. Sin is deceitful in that way. Sin gives us temporary pleasures that we think, okay, this is good. I enjoy this. Sin constantly tries to mask from us how truly ugly it is. Ryle writes this on page 17, you may see this deceitfulness in the astonishing proneness of men to regard sin as less sinful and dangerous than it is in the sight of God, and in their readiness to extenuate it, make excuses for it, and minimize its guilt. That's what we do, right? We love to make excuses for our sin, that it's not really that bad. Just a little bit won't hurt. He uses these phrases. We still think about them too, right? It's but a little one. It's just a small sin. God is merciful. God is not extreme to mark what is done amiss. We mean well. One cannot be so particular. Where's the mighty harm? We only do as others. Have you ever made these excuses? You're only doing what other people do. That's not a big deal. You didn't hurt anybody. You didn't hurt yourself. God is loving and merciful. Surely he's okay with me doing something that makes me happy. Do you see in that exactly how deceitful sin is? That sin would lead you to think such things that ultimately are terrible and lead to your destruction? Well, that's what sin does. Sin leads you in that way. And so, what does sin have to do with holiness? The last part of this chapter, J.C. Ryle gets into kind of those practical ways in which holiness is so important. And there's so many others. Sin is a barrier to your holiness. Sin prevents you from living before God the way God has called you to live. Sin prevents you from being the person that God has called you to be in Christ. So, what are some of the things that if we really think truly and honestly about sin, what does it prevent that then helps us to be more holy? He gives a few of these. First, if we understand sin, it prevents us from having this fuzzy, if you will, unclear theology that so many people have. It was an issue in his day. It continues to be an issue in our day. We see people who are fuzzy about what the truth is, and often, as we've seen throughout history, a lot of heresy, a lot of false religions, cults, those sort of things develop out of a loose understanding of sin. But if we understand sin well, it helps us to be clear in what we believe. It also helps us to prevent broad or liberal theology, as he calls it. This theology that is inclusive, if you will, that that looks at things that God has said as sin and says, well, they're not really that bad. Or we can understand them this way. Or we could twist and manipulate scripture to say this. When we understand what sin is and how clear God is about sin, it prevents that type of doctrine from taking root in our heart because we see things that are wrong and we know that they are sinful because God has said so. And no amount of twisting will allow us to overlook those things as sinful. The next thing we see is that we begin to understand that the routine of church is not sufficient to save us. There are many people who will go through the motions of church. They'll stand up when they're supposed to stand up and sit down when they're supposed to sit down. They'll make an offering. They'll be at church on Sunday morning. They'll be part of a small group. They know the rituals, but it's meaningless to them. Or even worse, they remain in their sin and find comfort in their ritual. If we understand sin, if we understand a proper doctrine of sin and how vile sin is before the Lord, those rituals will not be what we put our hope in. And even when we go through the rituals, which are not bad, but we'll understand that that has to be followed up with personal holiness. We're a hypocrite if we sing songs about the goodness of God, if we sing songs about being washed in the blood, and yet the salvation we've been given in Christ means nothing to us when it comes from defeating and killing the sin in our life. Those rituals are not bad, but they do not save. And if we properly understand sin, then we properly understand how we are to live before a holy God. We also want to be cautious of what might be called perfection. Some people think that they can get to the point in their relationship with God where they become perfect, where they no longer sin. A proper understanding of sin, again, how it infects all of our being, helps us to understand that we are always striving in life toward holiness. Not that we will attain being holy and perfect before God, but that it's our pursuit. It's our pursuit to pursue Christ, who he is, what he did for us, how he lived. We are to pursue that calling, but not to assume we have arrived. Sin is always crouching at the door, ready to devour us. And we must constantly be alert. If we are going to be holy, we must be mindful of our sin and continually put our sin to death. And then the final one he gives, the practical advice. He says a scriptural view of sin will prove an admirable antidote to the low views of personal holiness which are so painfully prevalent in these last days of the church. Holiness is simply not that important to people anymore. They're okay with the ritual. They want to talk about God being full of grace and offering mercy, but very few people see the need to pursue holiness. In what areas should we pursue holiness? Well, the very areas that he say are the areas of our life that sin infects. And what we do, what we say, and what we think, what we imagine, those are the areas that we must pursue holiness. Sin infects those areas. But as we're going to see as we go throughout this study, we should pursue holiness in those areas. So I want you to think with me as we close out this chapter. In what areas, of what you do, what you say, what you think, what you imagine, what areas of your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength does sin have a hold of? Because it's those areas that you need to be concerned with as we look through this book. As we pursue holiness together, we can't discount the effect that sin has had upon us, how it has dealt harshly with us. But because of Christ, we have hope. And so, because of Christ, we pursue his holiness. I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.